Hello and welcome to session 2 of the Instron Biomedical Testing Open House, Development and Production Tests for Vascular Stents. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Harriet Barnes, your host for this session. For this discussion, Peter Bailey, one of our senior application specialists, will focus on practical mechanical testing approaches to validating the durability of metallic stents, looking at aspects of data collection and the differing needs between design and production phases. For today's presentation, Peter will use about 20 minutes for his discussion, and then we should have some time for some questions, where we also have Kent Wallace, Applications Engineer, helping out to answer these. So I encourage you to send in any relevant questions you might have as we go along. One last thing I did want to mention before we begin. For those of you that are interested in receiving the single-use code for free access to the Essentials of Biomedical Testing e-learning course, this is just a quick reminder that you'll want to complete the post-event survey that will display immediately following this session. I'll be sure to remind you again at the end. So with that said, I'm going to hand you over to Peter.
Great, thank you, Harriet. Good morning to folks over in the US. As you may have gathered from our funny accents, Harriet and I are actually based in the UK at our Centre of Excellence for dynamic testing and fatigue testing. So hopefully you're all doing well and all awake and ready to go. The intention here is that I'm going to speak in fairly broad terms about the testing that's associated with cardiovascular stents. So I'm going to make a slight apology in advance to the folks out there who know a lot about this and know where we're starting from. But I'm going to go from basics up. And give you a broad overview. This is something that we as Instron, we support a lot of different needs within this area. But a real strand of it is that the device level testing is very, very important. So my own background is as a material scientist more than the biomedical side of things. So I perhaps bring a slightly different perspective than some people. So what I'm going to talk about is principles in the sort of engineering level development of stents, the underpinning data that needs to be generated, and sort of the in vitro testing side of things. Obviously, the clinical side of testing is much less of an Instron area of interest, although we do help folks who do tests on actual tissue components as well. I'm going to finish up by talking a little bit about the way the landscape is changing, both in the testing required for the FDA or the testing approaches, but also with a quick word about what's happening with the materials world in terms of new things that are coming into development. And indeed, perhaps some of our audience are working on. So, right from the very edge, from the top, what is a stent? We're talking about a medical device that's typically inserted into a large artery or blood vessel. It's most commonly done, by my understanding, where there's been plaque has blocked the flow in the vessel. Obviously, there are other uses, but that's probably the largest one that we know about amongst our customers. So you have, as in the picture here, a small cylindrical structure, and it's not solid. It's made up of quite a complicated and rather carefully designed series of interlocking sort of V-shaped or diamond-shaped struts. And these either have to allow it to be compressed and spring out into the right shape, or else to be undersized and then inserted and stretched out to the right shape when they're in the right part of the vessel. So there are some really quite serious implications there about the engineering design that I tend to think about more. Commonly, the materials that are used here, they're the usual suspects if you work in this area for what one might call biocompatible alloys. So then it is generally metallic. You're usually looking at a transition metal alloy. So you've got the old families of stainless steel, the slightly more recent aspects of nitinol, nickel titanium alloys, and cobalt chrome based alloys. The purpose here is really about materials which they're quite good for durability in terms of cyclic loading, but also durability in the electrochemical sense. Because while all of these alloys have elements in them which, if they were dissolved as salts, would be really quite unpleasant in a biological sense, what happens here is that you form a very thin, very stable oxide or passivated layer, and that protects the metal from dissolution, and that stable layer keeps everything as it should be. It doesn't dissolve, and no unpleasant toxicity effects happen, at least if you've done things right. So developing stents it's heavily regulated, and I'm sure that's no surprise to anyone, any of our attendees today. Obviously, that's for good reasons. I think most of our audience are based in the United States or certainly North America. So the FDA is going to be, you'll be familiar with them. They're the best known and usually the most stringent regulator actually on a global basis. We do have other regulatory bodies around the world. For example, you have the EHRA in Europe. But broadly speaking, the approach is very much the same. The requirements for traceability and data integrity are very much the same. So if you're meeting what you need to meet for the FDA, then you're probably going to be, if not automatically meeting other countries, you can at least easily adjust how you present things to meet what they need. So the FDA publish guidance documents. In this case, I've picked out the one that's the sort of first level guidance for stent development, stents and delivery systems. So these guys, you can go and search that up on the internet and download it free of charge. The guidance documents like this one have a very broad, in some ways, sort of set of words about the things that you should do or you should expect to do. They don't necessarily give you the specific pass-fail criteria or absolute rules on tests, but if you think through this and go through the process, then it does show you everything that needs to happen. And it really is. This is a 55-page document. This one, which, if you look at test and development standards, that's in other industries, that's fairly significant. But it's representing a really very rigorous test and traceability program, and that you have to show you're working, as those of us who have kids know that they have to be told all the time, show you're working in the exam. So what are we trying to get to? We're trying to get to this idea that comes throughout. As you don't need to read very far into that document, and you see this idea emerging over and over again of data, model, and validation. So you need to collect really thorough data on every component. Now, I hesitated about using the word component, but it's every part of the device. So maybe not quite from absolutely raw material, but certainly in the way that the material you receive in the form that you receive it. So let's take a rather arbitrary example of a piece of wire. You will need to look at, you really should know in detail about the modulus, about the yield point, about any strain hardening behavior. Equally, or from the chemical side of things, then you'd be looking at detailed assay, especially looking for any trace elements that you don't want to be there. Once you've got that data, or perhaps even before you collect the data, you should have in mind what your model is going to be and build. And you need to look at detailed numerical methods. So we're really looking at the finite element analysis world once you start getting into structures, and building up from component level. Make sure you have a model that describes your material properly and it matches with what your test says. And then you build maybe structural elements, and then you build up to the whole structure or substructure. The other thing is, and certainly the way I read it, that guidance document also now does drive you to assess some of the, shall we say, not say probable, but possible outcomes. That they're not the intended use, but they could happen. You've got to cover the realistic possibilities. So those models then have to be scrutinized and validated, and that's where we come into that really quite challenging area of testing stent structures themselves. It's quite challenging in terms of doing a representative test, but in vitro. So in an engineering sense, before we get to any clinical sort of trials. Now, it's really obviously perhaps it's really very important to iterate your designs based on what you see in the models, perhaps based on some of the outlying possibilities. And once you move forward into production, you have to keep maintaining that validation data. You have to keep checking the materials pedigree, the batch data every time you start a new batch of material, even if your structure design is unchanged. So, with the emphasis on having a full structural model, as I say, it's really important to have accurate data from the base level. Now, I mean, I think I had considered talking in detail about some of the things you might do. I don't think that really fits with the rest of the presentation. And earlier in the year, if you go and look on our website, you'll see all sorts of interesting presentations looking at more basic mechanical properties of materials. So I'm not going to use your time on that today, but we've got some great stuff up there on the website that you can watch again if you want. So, as I was saying, it's important to collect data for the exact material in the exact form. I think there are some organizations who are prepared to accept some of the most basic data with a certificate of conformity from their raw material suppliers. And obviously, it's the usual rules. If you can show good traceability on that, then it's all okay. But practically, a lot of people do batch release when they get new material in. So, and the point of this is that raw material batches do vary. Even in the very carefully controlled materials productions, which are processes which are used for biomedical products. So, but it still comes back to you've got to measure everyone at some point before release. In terms of what we do about that, there are lots of good standardized test methods out there. Obviously, your go-to is really ASTM standards. Personally, I do some work with ASTM on the materials testing committees for metals. But you have different groupings of standards, whether they're about materials or products or device level tests. You'll see in the standards numbers and designations, they come under different groups. And I've put at the bottom of this slide here, for example, metals, mechanical characteristics of metals are usually covered in E-series standards. a lot of biomedical tests, even materials tests for biomedical applications, actually come at F series, and they are deemed application specific. But you also have corrosion tests, which are going to be important in other aspects of device development work on metals, and they come under G series. So, all this sort of stuff, I'm always happy to have a conversation about, and my colleagues in sales support can equally help you. So let's get on to kind of the thrust of what we were aiming for today, about fatigue testing of stents. And for a very long time, the test has been laid out in this F2477 standard, and it's pulsatile durability testing. So basically, it's the fatigue cycle that happens when as the heart pumps and you get a pulse of pressure, the blood vessel dilates and then contracts again, and that applies a set of strains to the stent itself. So essentially, the idea is that you're going to place a set of example devices into simulated arteries. Now, there's a whole load of more information about that. We don't get involved in the mock arteries part of things. All of our customers who do this sort of work, they have their own approaches, and obviously that's very much in the commercially sensitive area, and they deal with that themselves. But ultimately, you've got to insert your stent into some sort of flexible tube with roughly the right sort of mechanical resistance. So if you're going to simulate 10 to 15 years of use, shall we say, inside the body, the standard lays this out as 72 beats per minute as being some sort of an overall average. And the numbers come out as 380 million cycles, 380 million heartbeats. So routinely, we see people testing to 400 million cycles. That is quite a large number of cycles, obviously. So the first thing you try and do is you look at increasing the test frequency, and instead of 72 beats per minute, you're looking at 30 to 50 cycles per second when we're just doing our kind of engineering level mechanical test, because that's absolutely achievable without any real worries for the measurement and the accuracy. But it really does speed things up, obviously. However, that still is going to take you about 5 months. So that's quite an amount of machine time. Now, when we consider that you don't just have to test 1 or 2, you have to get a statistically relevant sample, which means that you have to get 29 specimens, 29 stents from one batch, all to survive more than this 380 million cycles. So this is not really a very commercial option to test them one after another, or indeed to have 29 machines running side by side. Obviously, from the Instron perspective, I'm sure we'd love to sell you 29 identical machines, but that's not financially sensible. So we're looking at creating basically across the batch of specimens you need to do, you've got to run 11 billion loading cycles, well, more than that, just to validate one design at one size. So what we're looking at is actually fairly complex testing, and these aren't. We work with all sorts of industries with high value specimens, and certainly at prototype stage, there's a lot of money invested into producing these. But what we're doing here is what you might call a test to success approach. It's got a really nice simple pass-fail criteria. Either it's lasted 380 million cycles or it hasn't. fundamentally what it is, there must be absolutely no failure, no fracture of any part of the stent. So that makes life quite interesting. The other point to remember here is that we're looking at very small structures with quite interesting material, shall we say, from a phase structure viewpoint, and it certainly is not trivial to know that your whole structure is behaving as you think it is. So it's really, you need to watch out for both the structural and the material non-linearity. And certainly once you've worked the material into shape, then you get anisotropic behavior, which continues to make modeling the structures, as I was saying earlier, this modeling is really important. So it makes life very interesting for the guys who have to do this design work. So it really is important that you don't just damage specimens and waste them. So setting up well is essential. Being able to set up easily is essential, and collecting data thoroughly is essential. There is absolutely losing data for any of the specimens is unthinkable. And obviously we have the traceability aspect, that you need to be able to prove the quality and the origin of all your data. So I think I've really covered this slide already in terms of the need for testing multiple specimens in parallel. What you can see here is what you might call the business end of a stent testing carousel, which will accept 16 specimens in parallel. And that's really what I mean about doing things to not use one machine per test. So this is really the way that you speed up the test throughput. I need to remark here, so we're now pulling out to a slightly bigger view. In this case, it's actually a slightly earlier version. One of the earlier versions that we did where there's only 12 stations here. But what I wanted to illustrate here is how a batch testing system is sort of arranged, and how it also needs to lower into usually a saline solution held at body temperature. And then what this comes back to is that when we get to device level tests, it really has to be some sort of representative environment. It can't be perfect, but we've got to do our best. So that means the whole process has to be at the right temperature, and it's really about getting the right corrosion chemistry going on around the surface. Now we hope, well, you as device developers might hope that you won't really get any measurable corrosion, but you've got to prove it. And the point I've made at the bottom there is something that I certainly encounter from the materials testing world, is that when you look at fracture toughness or fatigue crack growth, you can actually get really very severe changes in the performance of a material between doing a test in dry air and doing it in corrosive conditions, even if that's as simple as in saline solution. So, I mean, coming towards the end of my presentation, I said I'd talk a little bit about changing methodologies. Now, what we were just discussing was a simple proof test of test to success. As long as you've got 29 specimens and they all lasted 380 million cycles, that's fine. Doesn't matter whether they would have lasted 380 million and one, or whether they would have lasted 500 million. That test does not differentiate. And it's very rigorous. It's fundamentally, it's been a good test. You can't misinterpret it. And the bottom line is that for many years, as far as I understand it, the failure in service of any sort of stent failure, even if it's just a minor defect occurring, is much less than 5%. So, you know, that's giving you fairly good confidence. However, we are now moving towards, you know, coming towards more like the, shall we say, more industrial engineering approach, certainly in the aerospace sector, in the power generation sector. None of the people I work with in those areas would even consider a proof test in fatigue. You test to failure to understand the whole process. You test to failure to get a better understanding of the performance and also to really understand what your confidence level is. So, I mean, a very basic illustration here of a fatigue test where they will look. This is a materials fatigue test output. You've got a stress level on the vertical axis. You've got cycles to failure on the horizontal, and you see they're looking for a linear region, and they're looking for a plateau at the bottom, below which then it won't fail in any realistic time frame. But you don't just stick a straight line down the middle. Not if you're seriously doing this for a critical structure. You make an assessment of the distribution of the data, and you draw this dotted line that you can see here, which is your confidence limit. And so you need to really be sure that in, for example, more than 99% of cases, you will always be better than this level. And really, that's this durability, this sort of is really useful during investigation and development phase. It really does help you refine the models based on my understanding of how FEA modeling is being implemented at the moment. It really does help you with that, and it helps you properly validate the model and allows you to explore some of the cases, the test cases, which are possible but unlikely. And going back to that idea I said earlier about data model validation, that really does give, certainly for some developers, that they really like that, and it's a real strength to their business. Finally, then, what else is shifting? And very much, I think, the hot topic of the last year or so in all types of high-value manufacturing has been additive manufacture. So I'm talking here about perhaps you might, those who are less familiar will have come across the idea of 3D printing. This takes a lot of different forms, whether it's using UV curing polymers or melting and printing polymers, or in this case, it would more usually be using an electron beam or a laser beam to melt metals together into the structure, into the pattern that you want. Now, it's a really serious thing. ASTM started running some workshops in 2016. I was fortunate enough to engage with a couple of those, and it really did highlight a lack of consistency across the industry and across in terms of how the technology is implemented and how production works. And on the strength of the interest there and some really great engagement, ASTM launched an international Centre of Excellence. They have ongoing work bringing about production standards and test standards. Within the materials testing committees, we also look at this and look at, is there extra stuff that we need to do in the context of these different materials, or more to the point, this different processing technology, and it gives you different performance in the materials. Now, personally, I have a real interest in this, and if you're working on stent structures, you should also. The fatigue and fracture tests are far more they're far more trying to materials than static tests. So I know people who can make you a piece of solid additive manufactured 316 stainless, and it will give you an identical basic strength test to a piece that was rolled or drawn as wire. However, if we put that into fatigue, then we will immediately start seeing quite different behavior. So it's something to bear in mind if you're thinking about this area. Don't just believe the basic measurements. Look deeper is always what would be my advice. So there's definitely stuff going on out there. You can see one of the example pictures I've put here. There are some guys, I think they are based in Belgium, who are doing a lot of work on 3D printing specifically for stents and publishing it. I am aware there is a lot more commercially sensitive work going on out there, but obviously that's top secret. Not even as partners in testing do we get to hear about that. So I'm going to wrap up there. Very quickly summarize kind of the things I've talked about. So engineering tests, your interests might be in the structure development or in the clinical side of things, but you do need rock solid engineering test data if you're going to get into developing stents. The FDA expects really, serious data collection, very rigorous data collection at lots of different stages. They do expect you to model the behavior. You can't just take an empirical approach. There has to be some mechanical modeling and understanding there. You also need to deal with making this statistically sound. So that means that you need large numbers of specimens. There is no getting away from that. It's just the way the maths works, quite frankly. So what that means is that you need to work with good equipment, with good software, and with sensible experimental design. And that's really how you go from looking at something which seems impossible and needing years of machine time or millions and millions of dollars of equipment investment to bringing it down to something more manageable, both in cost and in timescale terms. So I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to stop there and see if we've got some questions. So thank you very much for listening on the assumption that you have. And I'm going to hand over to Kent, who's, I think, been looking out for what questions we've got.
Hi, Pete. Thank you. So we do have a question here. We have a few questions. One of them, is there any testing going on using graphite as stent or nanocomposites for use in stents? Are you familiar with any of that?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and personally, I'll put my hand up saying I've not heard of anyone doing that. Not within the biomedical area. I think there can be some compatibility issues from the little bit that I've heard, but it's that biocompatibility I wouldn't claim to have much knowledge about. The one comment I would make is that people are experimenting with graphitic structures of similar complexity, but just at kind of academic research level in engineering. That's the only sort of thing I know about, but doesn't mean it's not out there.
Great. We had another question, a little easier after that one, I think. What's typical loads for testing of stents?
Okay, so we're talking about very small devices. It's something effectively like a very tiny spring. You're looking at typically less than 1 Newton. Oh dear, I'm sorry. I should have brushed up on what that is in pounds force. So yeah, you're talking about very, very small forces here. You're talking about, you know, tens of grams effectively in the applied force.
I guess a follow on to that question was, how do we measure those loads on each one of the individual stents? And how do you make sure that they're all starting from the same point?
You know, absolutely, that's an excellent point. I will just, if I scan back up to one of our pictures here, not so much that one, but here. No, that one's good enough to show you. You can see in this image, you've got a series of individual little push rods here. At the top of that image, you can see wires coming out. Each one of those little cylinders there is an individual load cell. So each one of those is stable up to, it will give you decent accuracy up to the test frequency we need. Each one of those, depending on the spec, one of those would be a 1 Newton or a 10 Newton load cell, probably 10. And then each one of those fixtures can then be individually adjusted. So in reality, by the time you've put each one of your little stents into its simulated tube, into its simulated artery, then it's going to be slightly different length. So you insert each one into its station in the carousel and then make a very fine adjustment so that you get a preload which is the right level. We're going to be talking a fraction of a Newton. So I'm afraid out of shot there in this image. Up above, you have an insertion point for something like an Allen key, and you'd make a very fine adjustment in order to, with a very fine thread, allowing you really good control on each one and the preload and the location on each stent before you start the test. Obviously, with that, I don't know about other manufacturers, but we provide live displays so that you can put up the force acting on every one of those individually, and you can be absolutely sure that there's nothing untoward happening, no distortion, so you haven't put one in and knocked the one next to it with your finger or your tweezers. So there's a lot of all these things. They're all very minute and particular things, but when it comes down to practically getting in there and doing the test, we provide all the tools that people need and all the data visibility that people need. I hope that makes sense.
It did to me, so thank you. So we have another question here, and I'm not sure what it was quite worded, but do you typically fatigue test single components of the stent versus the whole component? I guess it's just more the individual wires.
Okay, yeah. So I mentioned in passing about the sort of zigzags and diamond structures. So I'm personally, I've not been very close to some of these. Perhaps Ken might actually know more than I do, but I think we do have some customers who build really tiny structural elements, like they build one of these diamonds or zigzag elements, and then we'll actually do a test on that to check their model. And effectively what you're doing is you're then forcing a failure in one particular place to make sure that failure happens as you want it to. So like I say, personally, I haven't met anyone who said, yeah, I'm doing this, can you help me with whatever? But I'm aware there are people doing it. It's less common than the full device test, though.
Great. One more question we have, and again, you can probably elaborate on a little bit more why this might be important. There's a question about, since these tests are so very long, would you have a reason, and can you stop the test in the middle or somewhere along the test and then continue after? And is there a reason why you might want to do that?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think I'm not so sure about the proof test aspect of it with the original, it's just pass fail. I don't think I'd see any desperate problem with that, but there you wouldn't really see a particular value in it either. You start looking at the test to failure approach, so the F3211 approach, which I mentioned here. At that point, it is definitely worth understanding what happens. From our viewpoint, in terms of the machine control and the data recording, there's certainly no problem from our side of things. I wouldn't claim to know particular details, but if it was me, I'd certainly be interested, because we can monitor all those let's say 16 stations on the latest equipment. We can monitor to those live with every cycle. We can look for sudden drops in the stiffness, sudden drop in force for the same sort of amount of compression, for example. And you could look to pause the test at that point and inspect the type of failure that you've got. It's because it's not like testing a simple bar of metal where when you get to the end of the fatigue limit, it's in two pieces. When we're talking about a structure like a stent, then there are different things that could happen. And actually, that's a good point, because if you don't stop and inspect immediately, then you actually continuing to the cycle you could overlap, you could lose that indication of what the initial failure was. So if we talk about an expression which I've encountered a little bit over the last few years about data-rich testing, it's a really nice idea, I think, from a research point of view, and certainly from this sort of development point of view. You want to squeeze every tiny bit of data and information you can. So some of that is almost qualitative in terms of which strut has broken, not in addition to it broke. Our first failure was after 370 million cycles, but it was this strut at this end, or this flexure point. So I'm sorry, I've rambled slightly in answering your question. I believe there are people who do. Certainly there's a value in doing it from an academic viewpoint, and it's quite possible and achievable with the sort of equipment that Instron produce. So I think we were aiming to wrap up about now, and just to give a little bit of space for people to sort themselves out. Go get yourself a coffee if you're going to attend the next session. Coming up next, later in the day, I think Harriet's going to tell you a little bit more about what's coming up. Please do, if you have questions that I haven't answered, or it's prompted you to think about things and you haven't quite formulated that question yet, get in touch with us. If you already have contact details for Kent or one of your local sales guys, push those questions back to us. We'll do our best to answer them. And I think this is going to be available online afterwards as well. So I've got the slide up for what's coming up, and I'm going to hand over to Harriet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter and Kent. And as Pete just said, if we weren't able to cover your question just now, then we will be in touch with you after this session. Just a few quick notes before we wrap things up. Here's a quick look at what's coming up for the rest of today. If you'd like to attend but aren't registered yet, just head to instron.com to sign up now. The recording from the session will be available on our YouTube channel later. Each of you will also receive an email with a link to the recording. Just another reminder about receiving the single-use code for the free access to the Essentials of Biomedical Testing Learning course. In a moment, when this session ends, a survey will pop up and there will be a question related to this. You'll just need to complete the survey and indicate whether you would like access to this course. With that said, I just want to thank Peter for a great presentation, and thanks to all of you for attending. We really appreciate your time.